What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, big thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Smash that like button. Leave a 5-star review if you can. It really goes a long way. But I just finished recording a good interview with Brian Lewis of the New York Post. We gave our top takeaways from Nets Summer League. Brian and I were both out in Vegas over the last week, and we also had a good conversation about the Nets rebuild and the different directions that owner Joe Tsai and general manager Sean Marks can look to take this, kind of breaking down the different options there and giving some predictions on how it will play out. But before we get to that, the Nets did make a few moves on the transactions front over the last several days, and I want to break that down. First of which was they acquired forward Ziaire Williams and a 2030 Dallas Mavericks second-round pick from the Memphis Grizzlies, and they traded away Mamadi Diakite, who they got in the Mikal Bridges trade from the Knicks, and also the rights to Nemanja Danjubic, who was the 54th pick in the 2014 NBA draft. So pretty much got Ziaire Williams, who was the 10th pick in the 2021 draft out of Stanford. They got him from the Grizzlies, and they got a future second-round pick basically for free because Diakite and Danjubic weren't, two guys who were going to factor at all into the Nets' future plans. So really, the Nets here in this move are taking a flyer on a former lottery pick in Williams, who just hasn't panned out with the Memphis Grizzlies. He's entering his fourth season. He's going to make about $6 million this year, and this was a salary dump for the Grizzlies. But on the Nets end, Williams is a 6'9" forward. He's 22 years old. He's a pretty good defender who just really hasn't developed his offensive game yet. He averaged 7.5 points and 2.1 rebounds on 43, 30, 80 shooting splits over 150 games with Memphis over the last 3 seasons, has struggled with some injuries, and the Grizzlies just have a ton of forwards there, and he really wasn't in line to get any minutes this season, it seems like, with them trying to get, regain some competitiveness, and wasn't part of their future plans. So they ship him off to the Nets, where he'll have an opportunity for this rebuilding team to try to carve out a role this year and potentially earn a second contract. And, from the Nets end, these are the kind of moves that make sense for, where this team is at. It's helping other teams shed salary in return for either draft picks or flyers on young prospects that could potentially turn into something. And in this case, they got a second round pick, but in this case, it's Williams, who as I said, they're getting for free. And this is a guy who, steps into a Nets franchise while a different coaching staff and player development staff, but a front office that has had success with reclamation projects in the past. I mean, Sean Marks is going into a rebuild now, and while I think it'll look different than the rebuild that he, built out the first time around because he has a lot more draft picks and cap space and other things this time, this is something that he had success with the last time. He took flyers on guys like, Spencer Dinwiddie and Joe Harris, signed those guys to deals out of the G League, and both of them turned into rotation caliber players and pretty high level NBA players for an extended stretch there during their careers. And, mind you, both of those guys were older than Ziaire Williams is right now. As I said, he's 22 years old. I think Dinwiddie and Harris were 23 and 25 when they signed with the Nets. And Williams also has just higher pedigree in terms of where he was taken in the draft. He's a former top 10 pick, as I said, in the 2021 draft. So, are the odds are that, this doesn't pan out into anything and that Williams will probably continue to struggle the way that he has early on in his career. But there's that slight chance that he could turn into something because there are some tools to his game. As I said, 6'9", 6'10" wingspan. He can defend. He can shoot somewhat. And, he's shown a little bit of off the dribble juice at different points in his career. So a guy that the Nets player development staff with Jordy Fernandez and this whole new coaching staff that they brought in will have a full year to work with. And, if it doesn't work out, the Nets got a 2030 second round pick from Dallas for their troubles. So they really, there was no risk to this move, and there's some upside in terms of Williams. And if not, they got a second round pick. So the kind of move that a rebuilding team like the Nets should be making. And Sean Marks has, shown the willingness and the ability to carry out these moves and turn them into something in the past. So hopefully that's the case with Williams, and a guy who should garner some minutes, this season for the Nets. And, it'll also factor into, they have two forwards ahead of him in Dorian Finney-Smith and Keon Johnson, who may not be on this team, coming shortly or into the season. Things could look a lot different there, but I talk about that later with Brian. But keep in mind, this could be a precursor of things to come there because, making this move for Williams, you'd think it's a guy that they'd want to at least get some minutes this coming season. So I'll talk more about Johnson and Finney-Smith with Brian. But the second move that the Nets made was they signed Keon Johnson to a standard contract, who obviously played last season on a two-way with them, but has been, just balled out in summer league. So they elevate him from a two-way to a standard contract. It is a 2-year deal, the first of which is non-guaranteed, and the second year is a player option or a team option, excuse me. That's according to Hoops Hype's Michael Scotto had the contract details. But yeah, Johnson came in with the Nets on a two-way last year. He didn't get much NBA time at all, but he did show promise in the G League. He was around the Nets' top scorers, averaged around 17 points per game, improved his three-point shooting, which was a main criticism of his game early in his career and coming out of Tennessee, was that he couldn't space the floor at a high level. He shot pretty decently, shot nearly 37% on around 4 attempts per game with Long Island last season. And then he comes into Summer League this year, and he looked like one of the best players on the Nets roster alongside guys like Noah Clowney and Jalen Wilson. He averaged 16 points, 4 rebounds, 5.2 assists, 1.6 steals, 48, 29, 76 shooting splits, and really improved on a lot of things that were struggles early on, in his career. I talked to Nets Summer League head coach Steve Hetzel, who coached Johnson for 2 years with the Portland Trailblazers, and he said that they really were primarily focusing on his defense. Johnson is a guy who has better physical tools than, just about anybody you're going to see in the NBA in terms of his speed. He holds the combine record for max vertical leap, had a 48-inch vertical leap, but has had trouble up to this point in his career taking, those athletic tools and kind of molding them into an NBA role that would be functional for a team. The majority of those struggles were due to his three-point shooting because he's a shooting guard. He's 6'3". If you can't shoot at a really high level, it's going to be tough at that size to carve out a role in the NBA where you're going to be getting consistent minutes. So he started to improve. Didn't shoot it great at Summer League, but did show some more willingness to pull the trigger, hit some threes off the dribble, and also shot a lot better in Long Island last year. But on top of that, the Nets really wanted him to focus his energies on the defensive end of the floor using those physical tools, and did defend at a very high level at Summer League. And, on the offensive end of the floor, on top of his three-point shooting, the Nets also wanted him to improve his decision-making. As I said, averaged 5.2 assists, really showed a little bit of an ability to read some coverages and make some better decisions there and put himself in the best positions to be successful on and off the ball. So, Keon gets a standard deal, and another guy who should be able to get some minutes for a Nets team that is in a full rebuild this coming season. And as a young guy, only 22 years old, also putting him in the backcourt alongside a fellow 22-year-old like Cam Thomas. And as I just touched on, acquired a 22-year-old forward in Ziaire Williams. A little bit of a youth movement here for the Nets. And we'll see if Keon's a guy who could potentially round out those less polished aspects of his game and maybe turn into something down the line for a Nets team that's just trying to take as many swings as they can on these high upside guys. And, between Williams and Keon Johnson, also Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe, the Nets now have 4 first-round picks from the 2021 draft on their roster. And, it looks like some of the older guys, as I just touched on and will later in this episode, could be on the move. So it's a youth movement in Brooklyn. This is going to be the path, at least for the next year or two, taking some swings on these guys and seeing who pans out. So, it's a smart move for the Nets. Really doesn't risk anything for them and gives them a little bit of an opportunity under team control. And they can cut bait if they want to on either of these guys to see if they can develop something over the next coming season. So good job by general manager Sean Marks there. And now going to get to the interview with Brian Lewis of the New York Post, talking about Summer League, rebuild options, and a lot more. Hope you guys enjoy that after a quick break. And I'm joined now by Brian Lewis of the New York Post, who spent a good majority of the last week out in Las Vegas with me at Summer League. And Brian wanted to touch on some Summer League talk right off the bat here. Curious, your top takeaway from watching some of the younger Nets and some of the up-and-coming Nets at Summer League this year?
Well, as I think you and I probably discussed before either of us went to Vegas. I don't get overly worked up about wins and losses at Summer League, and I try not to get that worked up over individual scoring or uh, just look at the surface of the performances. But what I would say is this. I was very curious to see what Dorian looked like, uh, considering both his importance to the franchise and everything that he's gone through health-wise. Um, I mean, he said all the right things, and for the most part, did all the right things. But clearly, he was lacking when it comes to explosion. Um, Now, I mean, he got on the court and he played, which I'm sure he would count as a blessing considering everything that he's been through. Three lower leg surgeries in 18 months or what have you. Uh, and I don't know how much he has been working on the explosive part of the game, because when you're working on your game, you're working on it in segments or in pieces, and then you have to piece all those pieces together. So I don't know how much of the explosion angle he's been working on, but clearly his shot was horrid, left a lot to be desired. His handle is still loose, so he will still give the ball away on occasion. And I think he shot, 15%, 18%?
Yeah, 16 from the field and like 8% from three. I think he was 2 of 24 for three for the whole summer league. So not great there.
Right. Now, what I would say is I think most of us remember what Noah Clowney looked like in his first summer league. And at the time I said, well, I mean, the length is there. The mobility is there. He's a little late leaving his feet. He fouls a little, but there's something there. We'll see if Dorian makes a similar jump from his first summer league and if he stays healthy this season to his next summer league. I only bring that up because now we look at Noah Clowney, and I thought Noah Clowney was one of the bright spots of this summer league. This is a guy who he's probably not really a center. I mean, he could be a backup center. He is long enough and tall enough that I could trust him to be a backup center. But to me, I look at him more like a four. And the way he looks like he is capable of shooting, maybe even a stretch four. There's a jumper there.
A real one.
There's range there.
Yep.
And if he can show that consistently once the NBA season starts, that changes the dynamic of his pairing with Nick Claxton going forward.
You know, I figured there would be some comparisons to, or at least some allusions to Noah Clowney struggled big time at his first summer league go round, Dariq Whitehead's first time. Obviously, there are a lot of differences there in the fact that, like you said, Noah's athleticism, his lift, his bounce, the tools, they were there. They were apparent the first time around. He just frankly didn't look confident out there on the floor. When you're talking about Dariq, I think the expectations should have been low, hopefully, amongst the fan base. This is a guy, like you said, coming off 3 surgeries. He hasn't played in a while in real game action, trying to get in tune with all of his body. But it looked pretty tough, from a confidence standpoint and from just the explosion standpoint. Like, we saw him trying to attack some closeouts. We saw him blow a wide open transition, what should have been an easy dunk, blow it as a layup. And, we saw the shot. It didn't look like there was always a lot of lift on it. They were offline and things along those lines. But, this is a guy who hasn't played in a while. And this is a guy who, has really gone through the ringer over the last almost 2 years, dating back to his freshman season at Duke, of just not being able to be on the floor, whether from a workout and practice perspective or a game's perspective for an extended period. He just hasn't been able to do it. And I don't know if you saw, but he replied on Twitter to some of the posts last night about his struggles and saying, like, you guys think this is going to happen overnight. He said in another post, like, I haven't even started working on the explosive aspect of it. So, there's a lot of work to be done with Dariq. I think you'd like to you would have hoped that at least the jumper, or he never really had that tight of a handle, but just the jumper, the handle, the fluidity, some of it looked a little better. But when your body isn't where, it was when you were accustomed to playing in your high school days or even before that, and everything's kind of out of tune, it's kind of difficult to expect a guy to just, jump into the mix there and produce at a level of, I think a lot of fans are probably hoping that he produces at the level of a late first round pick. And I don't know, how much that was in the cards given him not really having a lot of time to get acclimated from a game or a workout standpoint. So, it's a little concerning with Tariq, but I think there's a lot more time before you're like pushing panic buttons about where he's going to be. You'd like to see a first round pick be coming along faster than this, and the injuries are still a concern, a very real one. But, he needs more time, and we'll see. And he might be a guy, is he a guy that you envision being in the rotation this season? Because to me, based on that performance, it seems like there's going to be, he's going to need a good amount of more time just to get his body in tune before he can even come close to competing with guys at the NBA level.
I would agree with that assessment. And going back to what you were saying, I remember distinctly Dorian talking about my goal is to have come back from the layoff and the rehab better than I was when I went in. And I remember asking him, I said, well, okay, for those of us looking from the outside, when you're saying better, do you mean physically better, stronger, more explosive? Or are you saying, well, I can't do certain things during this rehab, so I'm going to be better at other things? I was specifically thinking about his handle when I asked him that, because his handle's never been that tight.
Yeah.
That, he has a lot of strengths, or has shown in the past a lot of strengths as a player. Having a Kyrie-esque handle is not one of them. So that's one reason I was asking him that. But he meant physically.
Noah Clowney, you touched on briefly, but if there's two guys, that were in the mix when the Nets were trying to win games at the NBA level last season, it was Noah Clowney and Jalen Wilson, who again played at this summer league. And I think both played, especially Wilson, but Clowney also played about just as well as you could have hoped for, for them. Clowney, a guy who struggled very much so, as we said, in the summer league last year, showed a lot of promise after working in the G League and then stepping up to the NBA level, and really looked the part again at summer league this year with his shot blocking and, as we said, his floor spacing. A guy who, the 3-point, we saw a few pull-ups, we saw a couple step backs, we saw him, quick release catch and shoots. It looks real. So he's a guy, as you said, you kind of laid it out before, should be able to play the 4 alongside Nick Claxton and present a very real spacing threat, and a guy who just turned 20 years old at summer league. So there's a lot more room for growth and development there. But since you already touched on him, let's go to Jalen Wilson quickly, a guy who is on fire at summer league. Just his first 2 summer leagues. This is probably the last time we're going to see him at summer league, but, shot the ball pretty decently, across Long Island and his time with the Nets, but he was on fire. I think he's third in 3-point percentage among, there was like 110 guys to take over 4 threes per game at summer league. He was third in there. He ranked first in total made threes, and that's going to be his role at the NBA level. He's going to be a floor spacing guy, and he's going to be a guy who plays defense, and he's showing, after not shooting it well at Kansas, I think he was around 32% over 4 years at Kansas. He stepped up the shooting at a pro level, and he has the look of a guy from a poise, from a leadership standpoint, who's going to be able to play a role at the NBA level. So just touch briefly on what you saw from Wilson and how you envision him, kind of moving forward with this rebuilding Nets team.
Well, what I saw from Wilson is a guy who, at least in this short sample size, looks like he can shoot.
Yeah.
Which was the only question I had, right? When you watched him at Kansas, and granted, I don't get to watch as many college games as I once did, or as much as I would like. But when you did see him at Kansas, the only question you had about him when you're projecting him as an NBA player was, can he shoot? And when I say shoot, I mean, from deep, from long range. I don't mean, an 8-footer. I don't mean in the paint. I mean, can he shoot threes? And everything about his history implied that he was not a good shooter. Now, he improved his free throw shooting every year, which is always a positive. Whenever I'm determining, okay, well, can this person shoot? I like to see either they are a good free throw shooter or they are at least becoming a good free throw shooter. So that gave you some confidence, and it probably gave the Nets some confidence. But he didn't shoot well over 4 years at Kansas. He did not shoot from deep well as a rookie in the NBA. He did not shoot from deep well in the G League. But what we saw from him in Las Vegas, I mean, he was 32% or less in all of those places, right? 27% here, 32% here. But what we saw in Las Vegas, and he's confident stepping into them and willing to take them, which is almost as important as making them, that's encouraging. That implies to me you may go from, well, I could see why he fell to the Nets in the second round to, damn, how did he fall to the Nets in the second round? It really is that simple, whether he can consistently knock down open threes. And he did that in Las Vegas constantly.
Yeah, and the nature of a lot of those threes, like watching the games, some of these he's taken them. Like he loves to take that, off a dribble handoff. Like he steps back and takes a quick trigger three, like difficult ones that I'm even surprised he got it off that fast. And he's knocking them down. We saw him take a few off the dribble. We saw him, in high leverage situations, hitting shots. And, he's a guy, like I watched him a good amount at Kansas, and I watched him, the 3-point shooting was the main concern. People I think were concerned also about his ability to, create his shot at the NBA level. And there's still concerns there, but that's not his role. Like maybe he'll have to do it in spurts as a secondary guy, but his role is going to be to shoot threes and to play defense. And he's been a high level defender, in my opinion, in his time with the Nets and at Kansas. And he's still holding up his end on that end of the deal. And as a shooter, he's really elevated his level. And also, just a high IQ player, like a guy who finds himself in the right spots very often, whether as a rebounder, as a defender, as a guy playing off the ball, as a cutter or whatever. And, did have, a game-winning shot when they went to him as, an on-ball creator in an overtime period against the Magic. So, just a guy who I think his confidence level is growing. And I think it's a good sign because I think some people, forget that this guy is going to be 24 years old. So, like, yeah, he's a second-year player, but he's, pretty far along the line here in terms of his basketball development. So to see him be able to take these strides as a three-point shooter at this stage in his development is very encouraging. And, based on the numbers, and he was, lower in three-point percentage. I think in Long Island, he was a little bit better than 32. I think he was a little bit above that, but he's a guy who looks like the stroke is for real. And I think he's a guy who, based on his confidence level and his basketball IQ, is going to be able to contribute for the Nets moving forward. Moving on past that, wanted to talk a little bit about the rebuild and the direction that the Nets are going in, because there are still a lot of decisions to be made in Brooklyn in the short and long term. Want to focus on the short term first, because I think as soon as the Nets made the trade, sending Mikal Bridges to the Knicks, there was an expectation. A lot of people look down the roster at these veterans like Keon Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, even Bojan Bogdanovic and Dennis Schroeder, that these guys are going to have plane tickets booked within the next, 72 hours after that deal was made. And, we're pretty far out. The deals are starting to slow down now, and those guys are all still on the roster. So we spoke to Dorian Finney-Smith and Cam Johnson at Summer League, and I think those are the two that people were focused on most in terms of, whether or not they were going to be traded in the immediate future. They're still on the roster. What do you see in that situation? Are those two guys that you envision, starting the season with the Nets?
I mean, yeah, it wouldn't shock me if both of them are on the roster opening night. Opening night's not the end-all be-all, but that wouldn't shock me. What would shock me is if they're both on the roster for the season finale. What would shock me is if they're both on the roster, 1 minute past the trading deadline. That would shock me. I mean, and I want to be clear, it's not that I think they don't have something to offer. I just don't know that the Nets are in a position to value what they offer more than they would value both the assets and the future cap space. Right? I think they're both fine players. I just don't see the logic in keeping Dorian past the trading deadline because Dorian, as you know, has a player option.
Mm-hmm.
This figures to be a rebuilding team and probably a poor one. And also 3-and-D guys, they get paid.
Yeah.
So he's going to get more by opting out and signing as a free agent elsewhere. He's going to win more by opting out and signing elsewhere. And if that happens, you get nothing for him. That's just bad asset management.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if, like you said, if they started the season on the roster, but I'd be pretty surprised if they both weren't traded by the season. Now, by the end of the season. Now, I've seen some people say, Keon Johnson has 2 years left on his contract after next season. Like, they could hold on to him. He's not a guy who's going to, elevate them to the point where, like, they're winning games that they shouldn't be winning and, like, going to put their tank in danger, I wouldn't say. But I'd be fairly surprised if he wasn't traded because I do think that, there's going to be a lot of people, obviously, that are in the market for his services in particular. So, like, over the course of the whole season, I could see him. But the guy who, I'd be not surprised if he started the season on the roster, but in Dorian's case, I mean, like you said, there's 1 year left on this contract. So, sure, like, they could trade him at the deadline and, look to get value for him then. And I don't doubt that there's teams who are going to be looking to make playoff runs who would be interested in him at the deadline. But, having a full season with him on the roster and having a full season to kind of integrate him into your game planning, into your system, into all of that seems like it would be more ideal for, a team looking to acquire a 3-and-D player and implement him into a playoff rotation. So am I a little surprised that Dorian hasn't been on the move yet? Yeah. But I mean, you've been covering the team since they acquired Dorian, and I have also. How long have we been surprised that Dorian Finney-Smith has been able to stay on the Nets roster? Like, I've been joking with people that he might never leave. He might just be an assistant coach, after this and just stay with the organization forever because this is now 3 transaction cycles that we thought maybe he'd be gone. He's been managing to stick around. Like, did you think that there would be a scenario where he'd be on the roster for this long, even before the Mikal Bridges trade? I mean, it's kind of surprising given his age and where he lined up with either the Mikal or the rebuilding timeline, that he's been able to stick around.
Well, when they acquired him, they immediately got offered 2 first-round draft picks for him, and they said no. Honestly, I couldn't speak to the protections on those picks or anything like that. So, as you know, not all picks are created equal. But when you were trying to contend, I guess it made sense. Right? And to some extent, he's competing with Cam for playing time, fine. But once you decided to go this rebuilding route, I just don't see a world where it makes sense to keep him. Now, I do think the value outside is probably a little higher for Cam for age reasons.
Yeah, definitely.
You look at the age, you look at the contract, you say, all right, the asking price is going to be higher. So therefore that might make it both easier to trade Dorian and more time sensitive to trade Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody asked me, I would say, well, Dorian is the most likely of the two to get traded. But he has been here longer than I expected him. I'll say that.
Yeah, and I mean, he's a guy that I think 2 first-round picks at this point with 1 year left on his contract, and he's getting a little older. Like, do I think they could still get something for him? I think they could, but 2 first-round picks seems out of the realm of possibilities, in my opinion, and it might not the same exact thing, but it might be of the same mold of the Royce O'Neal situation where ultimately the clock is running out and the Nets are settling on a package where it's less than what they might have been hoping for before. Now, does that mean 3 second-round picks as it was with Royce O'Neal? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it means a late first-round pick or something along those lines. But bottom line is the clock is getting to a point where they're going to have to move him, and they're probably going to have to settle on a price that is, much less than what they would have been able to get before. And, when we're talking about Keon Johnson, while he's a guy that I still envision being on the move, that clock isn't there the way that it is with Dorian. So like you said, he's the more pressing guy and the more likely or the most likely net to be on the move in the, immediate future. But I said we're going to focus on the short term. Now, taking more of a long-term look, you've done some writing and reporting, and there's been a lot of speculation, obviously, amongst the fan base since the Mikal Bridges trade of what is this rebuild going to look like? How are the Nets going to play this out? Because I think a lot of people, naturally, when the Nets went into this rebuild, looked back to 2016 when Sean Marks took over and said, Sean Marks has done this rebuild before. There's a playbook there of how he's done things. But obviously this time around, like we all know, the Nets have, 15 first-round picks over the next 7 years. They have control of their own first-round picks in the next 2 drafts. They'll be able to create a boatload of cap space. So there's a ton of differences in the situation this time around compared to the last time. That doesn't mean that Sean can't do some of the same things. But if we're looking at, the length of where this rebuild can go, you outlined some paths in your reporting, and kind of path one might be draft a top selection next June and then let veterans, on expiring contracts like Ben Simmons, Bojan Bogdanovic, Dennis Schroeder, let those guys expire and then use that cap space next summer. They can have 80 million plus to acquire free agents and try to take a competitive leap maybe next summer, as opposed to path two, which might be getting that top guy, but then using that cap space and, those expiring contracts to take on other bad contracts, get more picks, and kind of prolong this, to make it a little bit of a longer rebuild, but build up that asset, base as much as you can. So looking at those two paths, what, based on your conversations with people behind the scenes and just your opinions, what do you think is the route that is more likely of the two that this team is going to take?
The former. Yeah, you're right. There are 2 playbooks, and they're very different. I mean, about as different as, Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens playbooks. They look very different. From the people that I've talked to, and I am going to assume that they are telling me true, they would be more likely, not dead set on, because you always have to be flexible and be ready to pivot, but they are more likely to make those draft picks and use that cap space to shorten the window, right? To make the rebuild a shorter one. When Sean Marks was here, you're right, initially in 2016, they had no cap space. So what they had, and they had no picks. So what they had to do was they had to trade and take salary dumps to get assets, right? They didn't really have another avenue. I mean, I guess your other avenue was to just build around Brook Lopez and Thad Young and which I will tell you, they interviewed other candidates for the GM job, and that was their plan. Not going to say who, but that was their plan. Sean had a detailed alternative, and that was to kind of play the system and take salary dumps and be horrid, but get picks that way. They don't need to do that now. They have more picks than they know what to do with right now. I mean, just next year alone, you're talking about 6. You're talking about 5 likely in the top 40, 4 in the first round. So they have a lot of picks and they have a lot of draft equity. So the plan would be to use that, and then in conjunction with that, sign free agents. Now, who those free agents are going to be, we don't know, because we don't know who's opting in. We don't know who's opting out, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, cap space is more than just signing free agents. You can also make trades using your abundance of cap space. I think that's something that gets forgotten at times. It's not just signing who's available. There are trades that you can make with cap space that you would not be able to make if you were capped out.
So right? based on that plan and what you're saying, preserving that cap space is going to be a top priority. And I don't think that should be surprising, because that's something we heard Sean say directly out of his mouth when he talked following the Bridges trade, was maintaining that flexibility in the new CBA and just for our team building strategy moving forward is going to be paramount. So I wouldn't expect them to move off of these expiring contracts like Simmons, Bogdanovich, Schroeder, and take on longer term bad contracts for draft picks or to use the cap space that they would have next summer. But to do that. But to me, the question becomes, they can open up at all this cap space, as I said, 80 million plus. They could even get more depending on other decisions. But, are they going to use that cap space to try to take a leap next summer or the following summer? Because, the Rockets still have their unprotected pick swap in 2027. So that's kind of, to me, always, been a little bit of an outline of, like, that's a year that I think they'll definitely obviously be trying to improve upon, not just for wanting this not to be an extremely long rebuild where they're bad for 3+ years. They're not going to want to give a top pick to the Rockets at that juncture again, like they did in this past draft. So, that's kind of the question for me. It surrounds, are they looking to, maximize that pick, maximize their pick this year and then use those assets, that cap space next summer to get better? Or are they willing to kind of take their medicine for the next 2 years because that 2026 draft, they still have that pick? And are they going to be willing to stick it out and to max out that pick also in order to try to get another top talent that year? So how do you envision that conversation?
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that factually. I'm not sure anybody is outside
your opinion.
My opinion is that they would try to go a shorter route, but you have to understand 2 years is still short.
Yeah.
Look how long Detroit has been rebuilding.
Yeah. They could still be they could try to be good in,
right.
The season after this coming season and still be very bad.
Right. But, I mean, look how long. I mean, how long do you think Washington's going to be bad for? Right. And I'm not, I'm not trying to be mean to the Wizards. I'm saying rebuilds can be very long, which I'm not saying it's the wrong way to go. I'm just saying the people that want to rebuild just understand it could be a lot of losses before it gets better. I think when I have said, and when people have said to me that they expect this to be shorter, I think 1 year is shorter and 2 years is also shorter, right? I think both of those would qualify as attempting to be short. Now, I agree with everything you said. The idea would be not to be handing the Rockets a lottery pick in 2027. But the Nets also very much value that 2026 pick.
Yeah.
If they can make a quantum leap, like the Rockets did, by the way, and jump, 20 games?
Yeah.
1 year? Of course they would do that. But you also have to understand we don't know to a certainty who will be available and who will not, right? We don't know that. Some guys can surprise you by re-signing somewhere where they weren't expected to. I'm not going to name names, but let's say, for example, that there is a player playing in the Midwest who's from New York, and everybody in the league thinks that player is dying to get back to New York, and he decides to stay in the Midwest. It happens.
Who could imagine such a thing happening?
Right. It happens. Or, what if there's a guy who's playing in Florida who does nothing but troll New York at every opportunity, and he's a clutch playoff performer, and everybody thinks, well, nobody would ever leave South Florida, and he decides, you know what? I'm going to opt out. I'm going to become a free agent in 12 months. It happens, right? So for me to answer the question factually, I need to know who's available. But my point being, I think the plan would be to have your powder dry for next summer. And if the right people become available, they would absolutely love it and not hesitate to spend that money next summer.
Yeah.
But they want to do it and have their plan in order in case some of them don't become available, that they could still, use that money, yes, you're right, the summer after that.
They're also, as we said, like they have a ton of draft picks. So there's going to be different avenues. Do I think they're going to want to part with, a ton of draft picks at this juncture in a rebuild? No. But if there's an opportunity to take a swing on a young player with upside, I don't think that, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibilities that they would try to maybe acquire a player like that and kind of speed up the rebuild. I mean, we're seeing the Houston Rockets now are 2 years into this, but they're all in on trying to make something happen with the capital that they have. So, is the playbook in Brooklyn going to look exactly the same to the playbook in Houston? No, but based on what you're saying, it sounds like there could be a lot of similarities in the trajectory that they're trying to take, correct?
Yes. I would say it's more similar to that than you could say, whatever, OKC, because they don't have a Shea.
Yeah.
They don't have that. He turbocharges any rebuild. He's obnoxiously good. They are not getting that player back in this trade. Now, the McHale trade, we can all see what they got in return for him. But the one thing that's not coming back is a young player of that caliber.
Yeah.
So, yes, I would say what's more likely is it would mirror the Houston Rockets, or if you want to say even maybe mirror a little bit of what, the Jazz are trying to do or have tried to do, then it would mirror OKC, only because he changes any calculation of your timeline.
And before
and Indy as well, like you're not getting a Halliburton.
Yeah.
Right. So you're going to have to do this through the draft combined with cap space.
And I've tried to caution at least some Nets fans or people I've just talked to who ask me questions about the team, because it seems like there can be kind of, like everybody was so excited that the Nets got their draft picks back, because how often do you see a team make a trade in the NBA like the Nets did with the James Harden thing and then be able to reacquire those picks and kind of correct that mistake? Like it just doesn't happen. So the fact that the Nets got their picks back, the right move. I think Sean Marks did a great job, coordinating that deal with Houston and the Bridges trade at the same time. But I do think in that excitement, there can be a jump to penciling Cooper Flagg in on the Nets roster for next season when, that's just not the case. Like you had Bobby Marks talk in one of your articles, you still need to get lucky. I mean, like Nets fans who go back, remember them people might've been buying John Wall Nets jerseys back in 2011 and they ended up with Derek.
They were ready. They were ready for John Wall, and boy, I mean, they did a lot of losing to try to prepare to get John Wall, and didn't happen. And we've both spent a lot of time now in Las Vegas. I wouldn't bet a penny on them getting Cooper Flagg. 14% is not – those aren't good odds. I don't care what it is that you're betting on. 14% is not a lot. So now that being said, I'm not trying to imply that Ace Bailey is not going to be good.
Yeah. I mean,
Dylan Harper isn't going to be good, but a lot of fans literally said trade McHale, get picked back equals Cooper Flagg. And that's not what it is. You could go winless and get the fifth pick.
Yeah.
Lose all games and get the fifth pick.
And that's the caution I've been trying to bring. Well, like I try to look at all angles of this, and I'll go to my grave saying it was the right move. This 2025 draft is loaded. There's 5 players. We just said Cooper Flagg, Ace Bailey. There's also Dylan Harper, Nolan Trower, VJ Edgecombe. There's a bunch of guys who are very good players. But the idea that the Nets are just like have the best chance to land Cooper Flagg, and that's like a far and away, like that's a conclusion. Like that's just factually incorrect. And then the idea that all of these other players, while they might look great right now, that they're guaranteed to pan out and reach star potential and just completely, vault the Nets into a contender in the next 2-3 years. Like that's not correct either. Like Sean Marks is a very good drafter. So I think it's fair to be excited because he's been able to find great talent in the 20s and 30s. So giving him a top pick now, I think is, it's better than anything he's ever had to deal with. Or, I mean, the Nets haven't picked in the lottery since Derek Favors, since they made that selection in 2011. So this is exciting. I understand it. But I'm just saying, like, we started this, and we're going to round this out soon, but we started this talking about the trajectory of the Nets. To make a Houston-like improvement, they have to land on a player who is going like an Alperen Şengün or someone like that, who's going to allow them to, elevate this. Because, they missed on Jalen Green. They did bring in free agents like Fred VanVleet and something, but you need a guy. And while I think there's a very good chance that the Nets could land a guy with Sean Marks' scouting and drafting capabilities and the talent of this 2025 draft, it's not a conclusion. So, it's not a guarantee, I should say. So I just want to throw some caution to some Nets fans, because I do think that there's, this thought process that they're guaranteed to get a star level player who's going to come in the first 2 seasons and just completely change the fortunes of this rebuild right off the bat. So that's kind of where I was going with that.
Well, I mean, they just acquired a former lottery pick and a salary dump.
Yeah.
You understand? That is the nature of the lottery. You just don't know. Right now, I agree with you. Sean and his team.
Yeah.
Right? Because BJ has run the last several drafts. He was a huge proponent for Nick Claxton, and you just saw how much money Nick Claxton got. That's a second-round pick. Right? So I'm not going to say they have drafted very well. So I think that gives ownership confidence. You say, well, if I'm rebuilding through the draft and that might be this guy's strongest suit, okay then. But you don't know. And yes, to make a jump like Houston did, yes, they had to hit on that pick, Sengun, and you had to get, grown-ups in the room, like Fred VanVleet, and you got a good coach.
Yeah.
You got all of that thrown together to make a 20-win increase. That's not easy, right? So at least one of these net picks, if not more, has to come good. And Jordy has to turn out to be a good head coach, which we don't know whether he will. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But he would need to perform well. And you probably would need to hit well in free agency. Whoever that is, whether that's, Jimmy Butler opts out and you sign Jimmy Butler, whoever it is. If you did all of those things right, maybe you could get an increase like Houston.
That's what we're looking at with the Nets. There's a lot of ifs. There was a lot of ifs going the Mikal Bridges route. More that seemed way more unlikely. So I think that obviously a lot of people are in agreement that the Nets made the right decision here, but we'll see how it plays out with the draft. We'll see how it plays out with some of these veterans, and we'll see, how ownership is going to approach this, and we'll have plenty of more coverage along the way. And I'm sure that you will be back on the pod as a guest, because you do such a great job and great reporting. If you guys haven't already, go check out Brian's articles at the New York Post. He has, a bunch of great ones, but the timeline and the rebuild articles that he's written over the last few weeks, I think, have been very informative. And I appreciate taking the time, Brian, and hope to have you on soon again.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. Anytime.
And that does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys really enjoyed the interview with Brian. Always an informative talk with him, very plugged into the Nets organization, and really just always enjoy talking ball with him. As I said at the top, if you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Subscribe to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. I'm a Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com, meaning you can find all of my work on ClutchPoints.com. Also, follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _ for constant news, updates, and analysis. We're getting into a little bit of a dead part of the offseason here in the NBA, but as I touched on with Brian, the Nets still have moves to make. There's going to be plenty of speculation of what they're going to do with these veterans and how they fill out this roster. So a lot more to talk about it, and I'll have all of that coverage here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.